Okay, you can go ahead.
Good evening and welcome to No Pride in Policing Coalition, third and final pre-abolition pride teach-in titled Policing, Borders, Militarization and Abolition. I am Beverly Bain, co-founder of No Pride in Policing Coalition and the moderator for this evening. We have an amazing lineup of panelists for you today. Before we get started, let me take this moment to acknowledge that we, who are No Pride in Policing Coalition, is broadcasting from Toronto to Toronto on the traditional ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We must note that the Canadian state has never upheld their obligations under these treaties. The very inception of Canada has been marked by the violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples and the brutal enslavement of African peoples. This colonial violence and settler colonial violence is ongoing to this day. We are gathering here today as part of our obligation to take care of each other, the land, and the creatures we share it with. 2026 Abolitionist Pride takes place and is taking place amidst the ongoing US and Israeli bombing of Iran, Lebanon, and the ongoing genocide of Palestinians. It also takes place amidst the ongoing neo-colonial, capitalist, and imperialist ethnic cleansing and genocide in the Sudan and Congo by the UAE and the US and their colonial powers. We are witnessing the relentless US attacks on Cuba, preventing oil, food, supplies, and medicine from reaching Cubans. Cuban trans people are being denied hormone replacement therapy and other medical support because of the US embargo. The Canadian government is complicit in not outrightly condemning and supporting the US actions while demanding an end to the embargo. Later on in the program, I will read a short statement from an Afro-Trans organization leader in Havana. The crisis at our borders with ICE and the Canadian Border Police, the build-up of policing and militarization, and the ongoing violence against trans, queer, and women by the police and injustice system globally continue to characterize this moment. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel. They will begin by giving opening remarks in the order of the introduction that I'll be making now. Stephanie Leach is a queer Caribbean writer and activist. Her work has explored the social determinants of health, structural violence, racial and gender inequalities, xenophobia, and police brutality. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Stephanie organized and supported various protests in support of the MOVA 3 and local BLM efforts in Trinidad and Tobago. Andrea J. Ritchie is a Black lesbian immigrant survivor living in the US who has been documenting, organizing, advocating, litigating, and agitating around policing and criminalization of Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people for the past 3 decades. Andrea is the author of Practicing New Worlds, Abolition and Emergent Strategies, and Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. Harsha Walia is a Canadian activist and writer based in Vancouver. She has been involved with No One is Illegal. She is the author of Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism, and Undoing Border Imperialism. I will now turn it over to Stephanie for her opening remarks. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for being with us today. It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Beverly, for inviting me and having to us. And good evening to my fellow panelists and to the audience joining us here tonight. So I'll begin with my opening statement. So over the past several months in Trinidad and Tobago, that's where I'm from, we have witnessed the criminalization of women who have dared to demand accountability for police violence. Much of the public conversation has centered on the police-involved shooting of 31-year-old Joshua Samaru and the subsequent charging of his common-law wife, Kaya Seeley, who was left paralyzed from the waist down after being struck during the incident. The facts remain contested by what has been impossible to ignore is the emergence of a group of women who have refused to remain silent in the face of what they perceive to be a grave injustice. Childhood friends of Kaya Seeley, Alyssa Phillip and Mariah Walcott, two young Black women, have become some of the most visible voices demanding truth and accountability. Through the 19 Bullets 19 protest campaign, they have organized sustained, peaceful action rooted not just in political ambition, but in care, friendship, and an unwavering commitment to someone they love. What has struck me most is not only their courage, but the speed and intensity with which they have been targeted for exercising that courage. In recent months, we have seen arrests, public intimidation, reputational attacks, and the deployment of extraordinary state powers against women whose primary offense appears to be their refusal to stop asking questions. Their treatment reveals something important about the gendered nature of state violence. Because while policing is often discussed through the lens of physical force, violence also operates through surveillance, harassment, criminalization, and the deliberate undermining of credibility. As some of you may know, Trinidad and Tobago has been under a continuous state of emergency for several months. The expanded powers granted to the state have created conditions in which dissent can more easily be framed as a threat to public order. Within that environment, Alyssa Phillips' arrest during a peaceful protest became emblematic of a broader concern: the increasing willingness of the state to treat calls for accountability as disorder. I was there when Alyssa was arrested. I watched police officers surround a young woman whose only weapon was her voice and a prepared statement addressed to the Director of Public Prosecutions. I watched her mother hold on to her as officers attempted to remove her. I watched riot police with semi-automatic weapons push protesters, including mothers carrying children in their arms, from a space they had themselves directed us to occupy only moments before. These experiences have forced many of us to confront uncomfortable questions about democracy, accountability, and the limits of dissent. But they have also revealed something else. They have revealed the extraordinary role that women continue to play in movements for justice. Again and again, women step forward to care for the injured, organize communities, document abuses, challenge official narratives, and absorb the personal costs of public resistance. And when they do, they often become targets themselves, or we often become targets ourselves. For me, this is one of the most important lessons emerging from this moment in Trinidad and Tobago. This story is not only about police violence, but also about the women who confront it and the consequences they face for doing so. What we are witnessing is not simply the punishment of protest, but the disciplining of women who have refused to stay in their place. Women are often celebrated when they nurture, support, and care for others in private. Yet, when they step into public life as critics of state power, organizers of resistance, or challengers of official narratives, they are frequently met with suspicion, hostility, and attempts to undermine their legitimacy. The question becomes not only what they are saying, but who they think they are to say it. In this sense, violence is both political and gendered. It seeks not only to suppress dissent, but to discipline women who have become too visible, too influential, or too difficult to ignore. In moments like these, it becomes clear that naming injustice is never politically neutral. It is always read through the lens of power, what is willing to tolerate, and what it moves swiftly to suppress. Because when scrutiny is reframed as threat, and when demands for accountability are met with coercion rather than response, we are no longer dealing simply with questions of public order. We are dealing with the conditions under which democratic legitimacy is either sustained or eroded. And so, with what I had hoped would be a moment of reflection rather than repetition, today marked the final 19 Bullets 19 protests led by Alyssa Phillip at the Labour Movement's annual Labor Day celebrations in Faizabad, the home of Butler oilfield riots. Yet her arrest earlier this afternoon reminds us that the conditions I have described are not historical or abstract, but immediate, ongoing, and unresolved. And while I wish I could share her entire speech, I would like to end with just a few of her words. A healthy democracy does not fear scrutiny. It welcomes scrutiny. A healthy democracy understands that public confidence cannot be demanded, it must be earned. Because democracy is not something that we inherit. Democracy is something we defend. I have been deeply moved by the courage these women have shown over the past several weeks, and it is my privilege to share their voices and their message with you today. So thank you.
You're on mute, Beverly. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much. I was on mute when I said that, right? Thank you. And welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Beverly, for hosting this conversation and for having me be part of it. I kind of don't know where to start. I live in the United States, where we are experiencing the consolidation of authoritarianism within the belly of the imperial beast. And what I know for sure is that it is all being advanced by criminalization as the core and central mechanism of not only suppressing opposition and targeting certain populations, but literally of manufacturing consent for the process as it unfolds. And when I say criminalization, I'm not only saying the passage and enforcement, often discriminatory, of criminal laws. I'm talking about the political process of manufacturing groups that are framed as inherent threats to a existing, desired, or imagined or past social order, which under kind of regular neoliberal frameworks must be police surveilled, contained, and caged, but under the accelerated kind of turned up on 11 volume of consolidating authoritarianism and fascism must be in fact eradicated and expelled. And I want to say we're living the after effects of decades of just incredible levels of investment in militarization and policing and punishment, and the expansion and intensification of the police state, such that the entire infrastructure was waiting to make what's happening now possible. And so it feels like abolitionist organizing was sounding the clarion call and the warning bell for years, including saying we don't want pride in policing. And because that call was not heeded, we find ourselves now in a place where the entire mechanism and infrastructure of the police state is being weaponized, and is particularly being weaponized at the intersection of sexual, gender, reproductive, and migratory autonomy. And the ways in which that is playing out is vast and multiple. And so we have seen particularly the targeting of trans people, both named as a terroristic threat to the very identity and fabric of American society, but also as literally the people who are targeting the engaging in resistance to the authoritarian regime. And the efforts to eradicate trans existence, both from denial of care of all kinds, to the denial of access to public facilities and public life, to the wholesale overnight cancellation of identification and changes to passport law regulations such that trans people can no longer enjoy freedom of movement or participate in public life, as well as being directly targeted by violence by the state in an ongoing way, in ways that we have been documenting, organizing, and agitating and fighting against for years, but accelerated again. Similarly, the criminalization of Black pregnant women and abortion seekers and abortion supporters, both in terms of criminalization of miscarriages and criminalization of self-managed abortion and criminalization of mothers and midwives and community health workers who are supporting Black women in seeking abortions where it is increasingly unavailable across the country, is an effort to return to a patriarchal imagined and real structure and framework in which pregnancy can be forced and patriarchal hierarchies can be enacted and enforced in the home. And of course, as always, borders are being enforced on the bodies of women, queer, and trans people as mothers, including one recently from my own community, are ripped from their children, violently hospitalized, and then thrown into a cage, solitary, no access to healthcare, no access to communication, that pregnant people in immigration detention are not only being denied food and care, they are participating in hunger strikes too at Delaney Hall and across the country to call attention to their condition. Women in immigration detention are experiencing sexual violence and forced parenthood by being denied abortions. And of course, this is not only in immigration detention facilities. We're really fighting the exceptionalization of this national, growing, more funded than ever police force that is engaged in immigration enforcement, as if it is not one and the same and of a piece of the entire prison industrial complex in the United States and of a system of surveillance and policing that has long been supported, grown, enforced, resourced, and legitimized by the people who now would wring their hands at, oh, well, now it's gone too far because we're shooting white women in the streets. And they are, in fact, the people who created the conditions under which that became possible. Mm-hmm. And we are seeing, so in the prison industrial complex writ large, Black women continue to suffer, including and die experiencing sexual violence and medical neglect inside prisons. In the state where I live in Michigan, 5 women have died in the prison for women in the past month of medical neglect and conditions there. And I'm also struggling with where to start and shook because we're a few days out from 2 major FBI raids of individuals who were protesting the genocide in Palestine that you referenced, Beverly, students who are engaging in activities that were completely demanding an end to their institution's participation in a genocide, and FBI raids and indictments of 15 people in Minneapolis who were seeking to and including in response to the killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, stop the invasion of their city and the occupation of their city by ICE. They're not alone. 3 people in Spokane, Washington were just convicted of major offenses for simply standing up to ICE. And so the kinds of responses to efforts to stop state violence and demand accountability for it are reverberating in the imperial boomerang in the ways that we were talking about. And we've certainly seen this exporting of imperial authoritarian violence through the families and the people bombed in boats by the U.S. military machine in the Caribbean, but also in the occupation of the Caribbean. I just came from visiting my 96-year-old Jamaican aunt who was outraged as to why there was a warship in Kingston Harbor from the US government. It was demanding answers from me as to how it got there and why it was positioned there to threaten Cuba when Cuba has been our ally since time. And I had no answers for her other than I'm fighting it, Auntie. I'm doing my best. But we are seeing that kind of reverberation throughout the Caribbean and North America. And then we are continuing to also see accelerated forms of regular policing of Black women, girls, and trans people. And I just am sitting today with the killing of a 1-year-old child of a Black mom who was alleged to have taken diapers from a store. And the reason Black women have consistently been among the experiencing the highest levels of poverty alongside Native women in the US, and then increasingly are killed or violated when trying to survive the conditions that are increasingly coming, including with 30,000 federal employees who are Black women losing their jobs, cuts to SNAP benefits, mandating work requirements for accessing basic health care, and then being denied reproductive, sexual, and gender health care. So we are really in a position where we are fighting on many fronts and really working hard to hold our transnational commitments as Black feminists, our commitments to queer and trans liberation, and to an understanding that the constraint of sexual, reproductive, and gender autonomy is all one of a piece and is essential to authoritarianism and must be combated as part of the larger anti-authoritarian project. So that's where we are. Thank you very much. And yes, Stephanie, my aunt also had questions about the 10,000 people that were being deported to Jamaica.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Andrea. Thank you very much. Harsha, welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Beverly, can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you so much for hosting it. And thank you to the coalition for all of the work you all have been doing. I'm honored to be here alongside Andrea and Stephanie and to be in conversation with all of you. So thank you again. I am calling from unceded Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish lands, also known as so-called Vancouver. And I want to pick up a little bit on what Andrea was talking about and what Stephanie dropped in the chat, which is thinking about the border and thinking about the ways in which border militarization is intensifying and the ways in which the border intensification and militarization really is part of thinking about internationalism and the ways in which that is bound up in queer and trans liberation. And so I want to start by, of course, talking about Canada, because that's where I'm located, and particularly because Canada is seen as, less evil. But right now we're in the midst of Canada rolling out the largest deportation machinery in recent Canadian history. And under the guise of Canadian nationalism and fighting Trump tariffs, we are what Prime Minister Mark Carney calls elbows up against Donald Trump. The Canadian government is intensifying immigration enforcement in a way that it hasn't in decades. In particular, the Canadian government has passed Bill C-12, which is a law. I won't go into detail because it has so many aspects to it. But taken together, Bill C-12 is building up the largest machinery of deportation in recent Canadian history. It includes mass exclusions, incentives for so-called self-deportation. It includes retroactive bars on when people can make asylum claims, and I'll return to this, but that affects a huge number of people who will no longer be able to claim asylum in Canada. And at the same time, Canada is building up its military, its policing apparatus, and also its border enforcement apparatus, with a 25% increase that are slated for Canada Border Services Agency to deport people. So 25% increase will be rolling out. And we've already seen an increase in 2026 this year. At the same time, over the last year, CBSA, which is Canada Border Services Agency, has really been pushing for queer and trans recruitment for border guards in this kind of latest iteration of liberal representation politics to produce moral legitimacy for state violence. CBSA has announced in the past year what they call a new quote unquote LGBT informed policy. And according to this policy, it allows recruits to wear male or female uniforms regardless of their biological sex. And they will also have a dedicated 2S LGBTQI plus champion to represent these interests within CBSA. And so, we can see the ways in which this kind of push is, as Canada is ramping up racist deportations, it is to give the veneer of moral legitimacy, of humanitarianism, of diversity, but actually it is a clear example of racist homo-nationalism. And, as a side note, because this is so peak Canada, and because, Andrea, you were, talking about what's happening in the United States, and of course, the very particular outrage with, when Kristi Noem was at the head of DHS and the horrific killings, particularly of Alex Preddy and Renee Good. Just this week, it was announced that Kristi Noem has actually been hired by a BC-based mining company, which is so again, perfectly Canadian in terms of the essence of Canadian imperialism and how it circulates. And so again, I offer this as a starting point, both to reference what is happening in Canada and to provide context for Canada, but also because oftentimes, even within Canada, our focus tends to be on the United States, right? Especially at this time of very frightening and real fascist terror in the United States, as you outlined, Andrea, and the kidnappings that are unfolding all around us with paramilitaries that are disappearing migrants and turning cities into borderlands, while migrants from Adelanto Detention Center to Delaney Hall remain on hunger strike, and resistance is mounting on the inside and the outside in cities and lands across the U.S. And we know that Trump has also recently increased funding for DHS. And so these calls for abolish ICE are, of course, incredibly important and so necessary and urgent. And in the context of abolish all policing, right? Not just ICE as a singular rogue agency, but ICE as a bipartisan kind of tentacle of policing writ large. But in Canada, the focus on abolish ICE means that we often don't think about abolishing CBSA, right?
Yeah.
And we think that it is just a US or Trump export. And so it is so crucial to think about immigration enforcement that is increasingly powered by surveillance technologies, not as something that is just US based or an export of the United States, but that is something that is happening worldwide. And this is, I think particularly important because the border is a linchpin in fascism today. The border stabilizes racial capitalism, especially within the imperial core, and reproduces gendered racial colonial apartheid in the so-called peripheral regions. Just last week, for example, we all have watched the horrific scenes out of Belfast, where mass violent anti-immigrant protests meant that people's homes were set on fire, cars and streets were burning, and people were literally hunting for migrants. This was not a spontaneous outburst of violence, but rather a prolonged and coordinated effort by far-right vigilantes and stoked by far-right leaders across Europe. Just a few days ago, the EU Parliament passed what it calls one of its most exclusionary and strictest deportation laws in history, which authorizes more immigration enforcement, more detention centers, more border militarization, and deportation camps, which they call return hubs in third countries, very similar to what we were just pointing out that the US has signed with Jamaica and many other third countries as well. This is a literal trade in human beings, right? Cash for deportation. There are no current final agreements in the case of the EU, but EU countries have largely been approaching African countries, including Rwanda, Ghana, Uganda, Senegal, Tunisia, Libya, and Ethiopia, for these deportation camps. These are also countries that, not coincidentally, the EU has for a long time been outsourcing its borders to. And we know that the Fortress Europe extends far beyond Europe itself into the Sahel region and Horn regions of Africa. Border militarization is also extending around the world. Again, we see the mass expulsion of migrants from South Africa, Haitian migrants from the Dominican Republic that have amplified over the past year, and on and on. So this state violence, this border militarization, impacts queer, women, and trans folks in unique ways, in ways that we know police, prisons, and detention centers are sites of gendered and sexual and transphobic violence. Bill C-12 that I mentioned, for example, has a particularly unique impact on queer and trans and survivors of gender-based violence. This is precisely because of this retroactive bar that I was talking about, which means that it bars people from making refugee claims if more than 1 year has elapsed since refugees first arrived in Canada. Now, it is widely known that it generally takes survivors of gender-based violence and sexual violence and transphobic violence much longer than 1 year to make refugee claims, both because of the kind of violence that people have endured, the kind of trauma that people have survived, and the kind of particular evidentiary requirements of an increasingly restrictive system, right? And so already 30,000 people in the country in the past month have received or are about to receive letters saying that they will likely face deportation. And the vast majority of them are going to be survivors of different kinds of gendered and sexual violence. But in addition to that, in addition to this disproportionate impact, I invite us to think more expansively, to understand the border as not only a structure of state violence that disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous, and Brown women, queer, and trans folk. And it's not just that migrant justice and queer liberation are separate yet interconnected struggles. It is much more than that. Border violence is fundamentally structured through cis heteropatriarchy. Bordering regimes are masculinist violence and forms of domination. Border logics are all about reinforcing violent binaries, like who belongs, who doesn't, who is a citizen, who is a migrant, who is a real refugee, who is a so-called bogus refugee, and on and on. And so the border is all about this kind of rigid essentialist thinking. The border itself is a binary. So when we say smash the binary, it absolutely is also about smashing the border. Queer and trans liberation, by definition, exists outside the confines of ideas of respectability, binary logics, and biological essentialism. We reject the idea that someone's identity, sense of place and belonging, and destiny is solely determined by their gender or passport assigned at birth. When we think about queerness and migration not solely as identity markers, but as projects and politics of emancipation, then we see there is a profound convergence between liberatory border abolitionist and queer liberatory ethics. They are bound up together in a politics and ethics of self-determination, bodily autonomy, the freedom to move and to stay and to be ungovernable beyond the logics of the dominant status quo, and to refuse to be acceptable or respectable or to assimilate. And so slogans like "No Pride in Genocide" or "No Pride in Borders" or "My Pride is Abolitionist" embody these kinds of ethics. Right now, we are witness to incredible resistance to bordering regimes in these times. I cannot overemphasize how significant this is. Coming from a time when people thought we were bananas for saying things like "no one is illegal," and people believed in a much more mainstream liberal immigrant rights movement about so-called good immigrants who contribute, and people wanted to build more quote-unquote family-friendly detention centers, to now having a much more robust abolitionist ethic and movement that is also anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist and oriented towards collective liberation is profound. And this is precisely the kind of practice that is being built every single day. People are organizing through direct action, rapid response networks, care networks, coalition building. One more minute. Is that a time? Oh, okay. No, it's all good. I'm also probably close to time.
I'm fiddling, sorry.
Oh, no, you're good.
You're good, you're good.
Whether it's direct actions or rapid response networks or care networks or coalition building or mutual aid, hundreds of community constellations of resistance are refusing the logic of borders. Much of this work to stitch together community and maintain our communal practices is, of course, gendered labor, with femme and trans and non-binary comrades at the forefront. There are hundreds of campaigns around the world fighting for solidarity cities where undocumented residents and all people are guaranteed access to public needs and public services outside of state criminalization practices. Dozens of civilian missions on land and on sea are engaged in life-saving and often criminalized efforts to provide food, water, shelter, and transport to migrants and refugees. Perhaps most profoundly, this growing articulation of defend our neighbors that is emerging all around the world is refusing the division of citizen versus migrant. And instead, we see each other as neighbors who share kinship and belonging and engage in everyday practices of placemaking and world-making together. And even more profoundly, perhaps, the everyday unsanctioned movement of those who defy a multi-billion-dollar border industry and risk death every single day. is perhaps our best reminder of the productive power of those on the move, of what it means to be ungovernable, of what it means to move, of what it means to refuse to assimilate. We are reminded that empires do crumble, capitalism is not inevitable, gender is not biology, whiteness is not immutable, prisons are not inescapable, and borders are not natural law. All of the walls and all of the cages will fall in our lifetime.
Wow. Thank you all. What is so inspiring about this conversation also is that I'm hearing from three of you, something very significant is that in each part of the region that we are speaking about, North America, the US, Canada, and Trinidad, is that there is a pushback against what we are witnessing today. Like, we are fully aware that there's a global movement by the rich, the wealthy. It's a fascist movement. It's a racist movement. It's a capitalist, fundamentally, corporatized, genocidal shift that we are witnessing in this very moment. We're seeing all of our leaders pretty much complicit in it, right? When we look at the US's push, we see what's happening, and we have to talk about what's happening in the Middle East, even though this is not a conversation about the Middle East. War is sort of a prominent feature here. Not only does it affect the Middle East, but we see what happened in the Caribbean in terms of, US warships in the Caribbean, the bombing of fishing boats off the coast. And I know that Stephanie can talk about this as well. The bombing of ships off the coast, the bombing and this and attack on migrants in the Mediterranean. The ongoing. So it's not just our borders as we understand them, but it's even our oceans. It's out in the waters. It's out in the sea. There is the way in which what we're witnessing here in terms of that global shift, that right wing, shift that we are witnessing, that is literally, consuming not just land space, but water space and every other space. And what it's doing and what we're witnessing is that it's certain populations that are being affected. And it is populations that are actually pushing back, and redefining the geographical sphere, at least in how I'm envisioning it and I'm seeing it. And I'd like to hear you talk more about the ways in which, we are actually able to think through and to imagine how we can be building some kind of international solidarity, political kind of, and if that's at all possible, for us to start thinking of building something global. There used to be a time when we had internationalist movements. I mean, I know many of us remember that, right? When we had international political movements where we literally, had movements that says we have to push back. We have to think about revolution. We have to think of undermining the oppressive regimes, right? But right now we are witnessing also that people are on the ground pushing back. I mean, I've never seen so much resistance in a long time as I'm witnessing now, right? So as much and as we resist, we witness the reins of the oppressive structure becomes even more rigidified, or attempt to be more rigidified, because we are exceeding those kinds of limits. People are exceeding it, and you said it. Borders are no longer confining people, and people who are queer and trans and women have always been, their bodies have always been bodies that have redefine those kinds of spaces. We have never been able to be controlled. I mean, as Stephanie was saying, this is a thing about Alyssa. Alyssa's body is seen as out of place, out of control, but it's also doing something in that space as well. It is also redefining that space as a space for which we have a right to be in. We have a right to demand something different, right? So I'd like to hear people talk about, what your vision or what you see or vision could be in this moment in terms of how we can continue this kind of pressure, this kind of work, this kind of reimagining, this kind of shifts that we are doing, but knowing fully well that we will face, forms of violence as we try to do it, right? And how we can do that, amidst all of this. So I'll let whoever wants to start to do this. So, Stephanie, do you want to go?
I can, sure.
Okay.
I think as you were, asking these questions, a lot of things came up for me.
Mhm.
And you know, I remember interviewing a bunch of regional feminists, Caribbean feminists from around the region about the feminist movement. And funnily enough, um, one of the questions that each of them reflected back to me was, is there a movement? They weren't even convinced that the movement exists. So when we're starting from that point, it's difficult to have a very vivid imagination of what it could be. Because I remember hearing Rhoda Reddock talk about, back in the 70s and the 80s, there was this big um, impetus to be part of a larger non-aligned movement. And we've seen movements shrinking over time for various reasons. Um, but specifically in the Trinidad and Tobago context and what is going on um, with our Prime Minister's position, particularly in relation to the CARICOM, we are witnessing what I believe is a deliberate attempt to isolate Trinidad and Tobago from the broader region and very openly and overtly seeking allyship and support from the United States and by the global North, which is a very deeply concerning shift for many of us. And I don't really know um, where we can go from here because I think that a lot of the trust that may have existed in the region has or is being actively eroded. And so that again becomes a call for us to continue to speak out, to voice our dissent, but I'm seeing similarities happening in Trinidad as well as in Jamaica with protesting the extrajudicial killings of people, about those protesters being arrested, increased violence on the streets. So we know that similar things are happening in our region. And we know that the connections need to be made. I think it is, or it remains still unclear for me after so many years in the movement about how we can practically make that work amidst, dwindling resources, but also amidst growing mistrust.
Great, thank you. Sure. Oh, Andrea? Andrea?
I'm looking at you, Harsha, because I think that I've been thinking a lot about this defend our neighbors framework and how frustrated I have been with the limitations of it, where people are sort of saying, well, the only way to survive in this moment is for us to organize on a block by block basis and defend our neighbors. And my response is people in Jamaica can organize on a block by block basis and defend their neighbors, but there is this fundamental power imbalance and extraction of resources. And I feel that lack of internationalism in our movements like so deeply and in such an enraging way when I hear that. And people just literally are like, I am not thinking one whit about women in Sudan when I say that, right? I'm thinking about me and my people on my perhaps quite affluent block, and not going beyond that. And I'm not saying that that is a strategy that we should be pursuing, but it has to be defending our neighbors writ large. And I've also been thinking a lot about how we have to do that in a way that's outside of and not mediated through state and kind of suprastate or parastatal structures. I think if we ever had any faith in the United Nations, the fact that it couldn't stop the very thing it was set up to do, and not just in Palestine, but in Rwanda and in Myanmar and like all of for Rohingya people, for it's just never been able to do what it ostensibly was set up to do. But what it has been able to do is promote a carceral politic and logics through this rights-based framework that is like, if you're, and through all the carceral bodies that replicate at scale the same things. If you look at the docket of the ICC and the docket of my local summons court, the racial demographics are quite similar, actually, and the same people can get away with exponential levels of violence without ever even worrying about appearing in front of any kind of accountability mechanism, because they don't even submit to its jurisdiction, whether they are the president or a billionaire, and so, or a trillionaire. So I'm really, and that's when we used to have the conferences, right? The Fourth World Conference, this World Conference, they were all mediated through these suprastatal or parastatal structures. And so I do think we have to rebuild that trust through relationships, and they have to be relationship, like really authentic one-to-one relationships. And then we have to figure out how that, I mean, and group to group and formation to formation and collective to collective and so on. But we have to figure out then how to level that up into something that is a transnational, global, Black, queer, trans, feminist resistance movement that is not it's transnational. It's not I think it's about a like translocal organizing, transnational organizing, not mediated through some international structures. So those are the things I've been thinking about on those points. But I was just curious, when you're talking about this neighbor and neighbor politic, if you have the same rage that I do, Harsha, when I'm just like, oh my God, you all can't think past the belly button of the United States. I can't take it right now.
Yeah, I love that.
Thank you.
Talking about this, Andrea. Yeah, for me, I mean, I believe so deeply in internationalism, and not internationalism in that way, as you were saying, right? One that is historically and continues to be mediated by states, but internationalism from below, thinking alongside Zapatistas and many other traditions of internationalism, but that one just from my generation in particular. Yeah, I think for me, what I'll speak to the neighbors piece, and maybe it'll connect to your question too, Beverly and Stephanie, what you all talked about too. For me, the piece that speaks to me about neighbors is not the NIMBYism of it, which is like any kind of hyper local organizing can end up being, can turn into a NIMBYism, whatever the scale of NIMBYism is, whether it's one's neighborhood or one's, kind of so-called nation state. But what calls to me about it is like thinking about it as an active practice, right? And how can the neighbor then extend to areas beyond? And when I think about no border politics, for me, it's like, it really is thinking about how we're bound up to each other at a planetary level, not at a neighborhood level, right? Because if I can see that the neighbor on my block is from a so-called other place, because that's how we're trained to think in border logic, then that means I'm not only extending solidarity to that person as my neighbor, but to the conditions that have forced them to move in the first place, right? That have forced these migratory kind of patterns and forces of dispossession. And so I think about neighbor in that way, like what kind of new social relations can be formed, what kind of new consciousness can come forward when we actually understand people in that way, not just as the person who lives in my block and I only care about my block, but that actual translocal internationalist form of like, we are genuinely bound up with each other. And there is no place that is not local to somewhere and to somebody. And there is no local that in the context of imperialism, there is no place outside of the local. Like my clothes are made elsewhere, my phone is made elsewhere. And so these conditions of violence and extraction can be transformed into something else. And so that to me is the possibility of the neighbor, which is certainly, not always articulated in its kind of NIMBY articulation. And I'm sure it's so different being in the midst of it, and the context within which people are in. And I think also the reason that I think about it is related to the question, Bev, that you posed too, around like this moment. And I think they're not contradictory, even though they may seem contradictory, which is that I think we need a deep commitment to internationalism, especially because in the imperial core, but Stephanie, as you pointed out, elsewhere too, movements are withering away. And, any generation older than me will tell me that movements just don't even exist. They haven't even withered. People don't quite, they don't have the same level of communal practice or commitments that prior generations and iterations had. And so holding that alongside the fact that, in advanced fascism and advanced capitalism, we are just such atomized, isolationist, kind of individualized ways of being are enforced on us. And so all of the seemingly small projects that build relationality, which might be hyperlocal but should never be NIMBY, are so important, right? So the ways, the seemingly small scale projects of whether it's mutual aid or get to know your neighbor, which, is just being a good human, but that's not late stage capitalism. It's actually a skill and a muscle we have to actively practice, especially in the imperial core. And so I think about both of those things as needing to exist together in these times of, and not necessarily a scalar question, but a question of holding both of them together. So I think about that. And then I also have been thinking a lot about the fact that, and this isn't necessarily universal, but I do think it's perhaps a fair generalization, is that, one of the differences between other eras of fascism is that in this moment, fascism is escalating around the world. Like, it's not just in Europe or North America, it is in places like El Salvador, like India, like so many other places that we can point to that have historically been the periphery. And that means I think we have to rethink internationalism and fascism and what it means to be in solidarity with the so-called global South. It's no longer a simple relationship. Or, the UAE, there are many places that we could point to. And that has always been the case, but it's intensifying. And so the importance of thinking about nation states more critically becomes more important. And thinking about the violences of nation states and thinking about how fascism and authoritarianism are escalating even more so as sub-imperial powers are gaining strength. And so I think that means that we also have to rethink internationalism, right? And how solidarity looks, and how power is reconfiguring itself. And also then trying to see what similarities might look like, right? So it might mean, as we know so well, that processes of racialization look different in different contexts. It means race is constructed similarly, but also differently. It means that the war on drugs is similar, but different. Patterns of criminalization are similar, but different. And so being attuned to specificity in a way where these violences travel, but they also have their own trajectories. And so I do think that's something that we have to be a little bit more attuned to in this current era of how authoritarianism is spreading in ways that perhaps is slightly different. I don't mean to suggest it's completely different, but I do think power looks different in this age than perhaps even 30 or 40 years ago in terms of particularly sub-imperialisms.
I really like, the point that you made, Harsher, about, about how we understand fascism. And I think that is, fascism has always been seen as somehow rooted in the West. In Europe, meaning it's a sort of a European context. It's in the context of Nazism. But fascism, Black activists have been talking about fascism long before as part of the entire racial structure. That that is where it has always existed. Fascism has always existed elsewhere, but we never named it as fascism. We named it as all different other things. But fascism was always present as a force that has been shaping other forces and ways in which it continued to reshape, as we are seeing. It's reshaping the world in particular kinds of ways. So before we go on, I want to take us to this piece, just as we're talking about, extending towards, talking about our neighbor And the fact that our neighbor is not just our neighbor next door, but our neighbors are way across oceans and way across continents. I mean, they are our neighbors. And in doing so, I just wanted to speak to the little piece that I got from Nomi Ramirez, who's of Red Afro Cuban Trans Organization that she founded. She is a Black trans Cuban woman and longtime organizer in Havana. And in a statement, she gave to me on WhatsApp, and it's also part of her statement on her Instagram, is that Cuba is in crisis, and it's not by accident. It is the result of the escalating US embargo and decades of US economic warfare and sanctioned state violence. As always, the most vulnerable are hit first and the hardest. Black, queer, and trans communities refuse to look away. They refuse to leave their siblings in the dark. I had this short conversation with her, and one of the things that she said in her short conversation on WhatsApp as she was typing, she said, "Look, I am exhausted. What I'm trying to do is to help others like me survive. Solidarity saved many lives. In spite of the bad things happening, we're still actually finding ways to celebrate and to have joy," right? And then, of course, unfortunately, Nomi lost her internet connection and we got disconnected, right? So this is the current situation for the people in Cuba at the moment, and for trans and queers, particularly Black and those of color. We know that the situation in Cuba is dire for them. I'm hoping that Nomi can permit me, would find a way to tell me how we can, support her community and support, her community in Cuba once the internet is restored, right? I'm not sure what that would look like, or how we can, find ways to, to support her community and to support trans, Afro trans, and other trans and queer communities in Cuba that's under siege right now. That is finding that, they're not able to eat, they're not able to sleep. There's no fuel, there's nothing, and they're still out there, if anything, trying to help, trying to save each other's lives. And and I wanted to take us into talking a bit about, and all I'm hearing in terms of, and what I just heard is also about, how we understand abolition. And I want to speak about what abolition is in this moment, as we talk about, and we talk about it throughout. It came up in many different ways in terms of, how we rid ourselves of the ongoing buildup of militarization, of policing, but how, most importantly, is how we care, how we extend care, how we build care and support, and ways that are livable for each other, how we stand up for each other, how we fight with each other, so that we can, protect each other. And we're seeing that happening in Trinidad. We're seeing that happening in Sudan. We're seeing it happen in the Congo, that amidst all of what the ravages that people are experiencing, people are still fighting for each other, right? So I just wanted to throw that out and hear from you, your thoughts around abolition in this very moment. Thanks.
I mean, I'll just say briefly from where I sit, it's a tremendous opportunity for organizers, because the police state and what it makes possible is laid bare. Now, it's not an easy organizing thing. Like I said, we have to stop people from exceptionalizing ICE. Thank goodness Harsha writes pieces that I just shove in people's face and keep it moving. We can't, we have to stop. Have folks need to stop believing that there's some way we can turn the system to address the violence of the system. The number of people on a Migra watch who want to call the cops, that's a frustrating moment, and that's an organizing opportunity, right? And the fact that even folks in Minneapolis who, were voting whether or not to abolish their police department 6 years ago, were turning to the police being like, "Aren't you going to protect us from these thugs?" And the police were like, "No," right? And so, and showing their faces, right? And I think, and showing who they truly were, and that's an opportunity and a moment to seize. But I do think that the other way to seize it is also through this culture of care where people are just like, I am not going to let my neighbors who are using SNAP benefits starve. I am not going to let people go without diapers because their benefits have been cut off. I'm not going to let people go without care. We are going to set up a clinic as healthcare workers and make sure that people who are afraid to go get care because they're migrants, whose care is being denied and eradicated and defunded and criminalized, where people are making sure that people get what they need. And that is an opportunity also to say, hi, this is Abolition. Welcome to Abolition, where we do this, where we offer care without criminalization, where we offer care without policing, where we offer care without, as you were saying, Harsha, saying, you are from there and therefore you don't deserve care, or you are from that group that is inherently a threat and therefore you don't deserve care, or you did something that I have some serious concerns about and therefore you deserve no care, and we're really in a moment where with good organizing we can really open another portal in the direction of helping people really understand that abolition is not only sort of it's the only way we're going to survive, literally. That our best chance, that uprooting criminalization, striking at the heart of the military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, and of our own investment in criminalization and policing is our best and only chance of defeating fascism and globally. And I will say what I feel is particularly different about this moment is that it's happening in the seat of the largest economy in the world and the largest military in the world. And I feel like when people sort of are making analogies to other things in other places, I'm a little confused because I'm like, yes, there have been fascist tendencies, fascist trends, fascist systems of control over Black and Indigenous people in the United States, but this complete seizure of all institutions at this level of economy and this level of military is something else. And that doesn't mean that we don't have lessons from abolitionist organizing that we can use, but it's only through, there's no going back to what was. The only way out, the only way forward is by caring for each other in ways that are about uprooting our commitment to criminalization. And to the extent that we hold on to criminalization as some kind of possibility for rectifying the situation, that's the kryptonite to our ability to actually fight what we're up against. And that's also true of the planet. I mean, abolition requires us also to attend to the ways in which the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex is driving the collapse of the planet and our ecologies. And so this is an opportunity to help people understand that and to help people live that and experience that. But it is, it's like an organizing, what's the final exam you have to do when you do a dissertation? Like it's like your comprehensives, like it's our organizing comprehensives right now. Like we really have to be able to step into that moment to help people see that possibility, because the more under pressure we are, the more we want to reach for the things we know. We want to double down on the things that we think will get us free, when in fact they're what got us here. And so it's really, but I think we can accomplish that through, and I really appreciate you reorienting that neighbor culture of care framework, Harsha, I think we can get there through the way that you're describing, which is abolition, which is acting as if every life is precious.
Stephanie, do you want to add? In terms of how you envision this whole concept of abolition, particularly in the context that you are actually organizing right now, and what's happening in the context of on the street in Trinidad in this very moment, with the buildup of policing and the ongoing attack on dissent and people's right to occupy the streets in this moment against. And just if you can do so, if you can also add, Stephanie, one of the things I don't think people got clear is the reason why this happened in the first place, this protests on the street, why this was taking place, what actually happened that has brought people onto the streets. Do you mind sharing that?
Sure.
Yeah, because I don't think
well, this is what brought them onto the streets this time around, because it's been happening.
Right.
But
This time around, no, you're absolutely right. But this time around, absolutely. The most
yeah,
reason for people on the street in this moment, and the way in which the police has been incredibly brutal and harassing, you know.
yeah. So on this particular occasion, people have been protesting because the police killed a young man, um, Joshua, um, who was 31 years old, who was unquote fleeing from the police, but pulled over in his car. He had his girlfriend in the passenger seat and was shot with 19 bullets, hence the 19 bullets, 19 protests. And within that crossfire with the police, his wife slash common law, his girlfriend slash common law wife, Kaya Seeley, was also struck and ended up being paralyzed from the waist down as a result of that gunfire. And to everyone's shock, 5 months later, she was actually charged with the murder of her boyfriend and of shooting 3 police officers, and just left everybody completely stunned, because we saw the CCTV footage just as what happened in
He had his hand out the
2021.
car. Didn't he have his hand out the car
He
when they?
had his hands out of the car in surrender.
Yeah.
And this exact thing happened in 2021, where CCTV footage was leaked showing the police killing 3 men who are now called the Mover Three. So I think at this time, so a few things to say about abolition is one, I think that the Caribbean does not really have the language of abolition. Um, and more than necessarily having the language of abolition, I think that we are lacking alternative models and frameworks that exist in our history that we can turn to. Places like the US and Canada, of course, the levels of violence cannot be compared, but a very different history and trajectory of various kinds of people and groups, modeling what is possible.
Mhm.
Um, in the Caribbean, I think it has been um, a lot more challenging for us,
Mhm.
to see what what are the other possibilities, particularly when there seems to be a lack of leadership. And when I say a lack of leadership, I don't mean at the state level. I'm not talking about politicians. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about even civil society, those of us who are working in unions and all of the various other institutions that we are looking to for alternatives, and they're just not there.
Mhm.
Um, so it's really difficult, and it's sad for me to say this, to see alternatives. I don't know, we say abolish the police. It's something that, Americans say or Canadians say, or, but what does that mean? Here in Trinidad, like, who is replacing them? And, in the Caribbean, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, Beverly, we used to have, because I don't even think that exists anymore, we used to have what we call community leaders, right? Which were known as the local gangmen, who,
As you were
yeah,
saying
they,
that, I was thinking, you said, who replaced them? I said, well, the gangs. I mean, they
right, the
way
gangs.
more organized, and they protect it. They protect people. They protect
Yes,
the communities. You know what I mean? They
but
protect
the
what they
gangs have
do.
also been targeted, and the gangs have been systematically dismantled by the
But
states as well.
of course,
So, yeah, and this didn't start with this government, it started even before that, where, elders in gangs were systematically taken out. And so now you have complete disorder
yeah,
in the underworld. And that's how they want it,
yes,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
Um, so I mean, I think abolition has to be an ongoing conversation in the Caribbean context. And I think we are just generally scared and frightened at this point because we just don't know what the alternative is, because we can see none within our sights, you know.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Harsha?
Thank you all. This is just such a rich conversation. I'm so grateful.
Very
Truly.
generative, very rich. Yes.
Yeah. I think I may be repetitive here, but I think for me, and this may answer this question for me about abolition, because and I appreciate Andrea and Stephanie, both of what you said, because for me, in some sense, I feel clear, not in a way of having answers, but being like, we fight fascism with solidarity and internationalism and, and anti-criminalization and on and on.
Mhm.
But I return to what I was saying earlier too, which is that I think a big part of internationalism for me is the humility of place-based specificity. And so for me, part of that, and when I think of abolition and I think of many, or I think about internationalism, or I think about decolonization or anti-imperialism and on, which I think are all very connected and intertwined frameworks. A big part of it for me is that we can't actually have internationalism without being attuned to what it means for different people in different contexts and struggle. And so I'm a little bit hesitant to offer anything prescriptive, even about the very tiny location that I'm in, because even that is always changing, other than to say a commitment to struggle and relationality. For me, that is part of it. None of these are end goals. They are all iterative, open processes that are about a commitment to struggle and a commitment to end state violence in all its forms. And I do think a big part of abolition today is to not even underestimate that we even know all of those tentacles, right? Because there are just so many reconfigurations of power. Like,
Mhm.
the cops are not just the cops, they're everywhere. They're in social work, they're in schools, they're in hospitals, the border is literally everywhere. Um, there's these new deportation camps are everywhere. And so it's dizzying. And so not in a way that, and we know it's meant to disorient us. And so for me, I think part of the promise of abolitionist politics, of abolitionist internationalism, of decolonial internationalism is to be able to weave some of these threads in a way that helps us see each other, not necessarily across similar, not to suggest that we're all the same, because of course we're in completely radically different contexts in many cases, but to be able to see ourselves mirrored in what we're fighting against. And a big part of that is, of course, state violence and criminalization, and fascism as colonialism, right? As you pointed out, that it's not something new. It's just new when it looks different in this iteration. And so, for me, a big part of it is that it's cheesy to say, but I do think it is the process of building internationalism, which I think is so important in an era of social media where it can be very easy to assume that we know what is happening elsewhere, or we transpose that based on our context. But the actual relationality of being in conversation to understand what the contexts are for everyone, as Stephanie, you just pointed out, right? It looks so specific. I think that for me is a big part of abolitionist practice and a big part of organizing. And I would also echo, Andrew, what you said. I think it's a tremendous opportunity because liberalism has laid bare,
Yep.
like its masks are off, the facade is no longer there, from all the many genocides from Palestine to Sudan to Congo to the ongoing genocide here, to, the facade of international law, and on and on. And so there's a tremendous opportunity to bring people onto a different kind of path to fight fascism. And at the same time, that vacuum is terrifying, right? Because if we don't fight back, then absolutely more and more people will either be turned to, will be turned towards fascism for all of the reasons that it pulls people in, or it'll pull people into deep apathy because people feel overwhelmed and that, well, if this is just how it's going to be, and I'm going to face severe repression for fighting back, and on top of that, nothing will change, then what's the point, And so, I do think there's something there that is much more about our embodied relations and our affect that we have to tend to, that isn't just about the right political position. It's about how do we actually build the possibility of keeping people and bringing people into struggle in these tremendously repressive times.
Absolutely. Thank you.
One thing I would like to say, though,
Yes.
you
And,
know,
and just to say, if people have comments or thing they want to share with each other, please do that. Yes, Stephanie.
yeah, I was just gonna say one thing I want to say, is that, despite my previous evaluation of the region, um, the past couple of weeks and months have been really fascinating to me to witness. As an activist that has, taken a back seat over the past couple of years of really being re-inspired by these young people who are speaking out, and people who you would never would have imagined would engage politically, influencers, people from the church, a very diverse range of actors are emerging as voices speaking out against state violence. And it is a moment, I think, that needs to be, I guess, um, understood as important and as sacred. And for those of us who have been in the movement for a longer time and have different experiences and perhaps understand the significance of solidarity across borders and reaching out, can provide some support and guidance to the new and emerging voices. And I think that's where my role is at this point in time. And so, it's not that there's no hope, but there's new hope that's leading us into different directions. And it will not look like what it looked like 40 years ago. It will look different. But I think that, something is happening on the ground here. And I felt that way back in 2021, and I feel it now again. And this is the most amount of voices that I have seen on the ground, taking notice and speaking out against what is happening, like literally right in front of our eyes. And the state is like, denying, saying that we can't trust our own eyes.
Yeah.
So I think people have had enough at this point.
Yeah.
And that is the starting point.
Yeah.
It's a new one, at least.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Andrea, or let me just say, let me share a couple of things with you. Just not people who are following, they in the comments like amazing collective conversation. People are finding it fascinating and very important at this time, in this moment. Someone says even more terrifying than the racists are the ones who are apathetic. Right? Like, and someone said, agreed, Stephanie, we must acknowledge the emergence of Gen Z on the scene, which gives such hope, right? And tackling apathy has been the hardest task thus far. So these are some comments that people are thinking as we're talking, as you are talking, people are thinking and resonating with a lot of what you're sharing. I mean, this is such a I find this very transformative and very generative and so significant in this time. I'm so grateful for you all here. I want to offer you an opportunity to, just to offer you an opportunity for closing, to share what you'd like to leave us with in this moment, as we continue to fight and continue to go forward and to continue to struggle and to build solidarity and to build international struggle, what you want to leave us with at this time. So who wants to? Andrea, do you want to go? Am I picking on you, Andrea?
No, not at all. I want to go so we can end with my comrades. I can just say a few things and then we can hear from the folks who
You're the one I know. You're the one I know the longest here.
No, I know. But also I know that Harsha and Stephanie will
Your
bring us
families,
home.
I pick on family.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. And I really deeply appreciate this conversation and being able to be in conversation with you always, as someone who sharpens me and helps me grow. And then same with Harsha always. And Stephanie, it's such a joy to meet you and be in conversation with you. So thank you. And I'm so grateful for the work you're doing on the ground. And it really resonates with work that Beverly and I and many have been doing for years. I think what you were saying about how people sort of say, well, sure, the police, but what instead? That it's not, it's, I hear that everywhere. We heard that everywhere in 2020. We hear that particularly in Black and Brown communities, but also as survivors and as queer and trans people. And I've definitely had trans women say, cool, abolition, Andrea, but when my life is at risk, I'm gonna call whoever is gonna help me get to the next minute, and until you can commit to me, a space where the community that we are talking about sort of as this, um, ephemeral thing will actually show up for me as a Black trans woman, then, but at the same time, in that moment, Black trans women do show up for each other and protect each other because the cops are definitely not showing up for them. And when they show up, they bring more violence more often than not than they bring anything else. And so my response, and again, our sort of challenge as organizers and as humans is to say, but what are they doing now? What are the police doing now? And there's not going to be one alternative to them. There's going to be, as Mariam Kaba and many others have said, there are going to be a million responses. I've heard one organizer say a cop is just 1,000 jobs smashed into one person with a gun. And, there's just so many things. And then also to look at what we do, because in fact, I don't live in Jamaica. I'm in relationship with Jamaica, but cops are not doing anything for anybody I know who needs protection or safety. But people are doing things with and for each other in the face of abandonment by the police, by the state, by the globe, historically and presently, that I'm hoping we can reach for and draw from, while also being real about the atomization and the disaffection and the resignation that has come from fighting for revolution after revolution after revolution, only to be hit with IMF and corruption and imperialism and more US imperialism and more US extraction. That there is a moment where people say, I'm tired, I'm not fighting no more. And I feel like that is something we also have to be real about. So I'm not sort of offering let's pretend, let's go back to Maroonage. Maroonage was, first of all, hard and not what we imagine it to be. And secondly, this is a different time and place, and we have to respond, as Harsha is saying, to the times and places that we're in. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to think alongside with you all as to what that might look like in transnational Black feminist struggle. So thank you, particularly on Pride. Deeply grateful.
Thank you. Harsha?
Yeah, thank you so much again, Beverly, for bringing us together. And thank you so much, Andrea and Stephanie. I just feel so deeply humbled and grateful to be in this conversation. And to just learn a tremendous amount, as I have before and as I did today. I feel like I'm stewing on what folks have said. I don't know that I have anything in particular to add other than just, sitting in this moment and the immensity of it. And I think the most, in this vein of Andrea's, you were offering, so much of organizing is offering people practical responses, right? It's like we want all these things, and the reality on the ground is that everyone's material needs are so much more immense than perhaps they have ever been because of the cost of living crisis that we're in, compounded by violence. And so it's incredibly rough out there. And so I think one perhaps reminder for myself is also that sometimes when we think about these things, they seem forward-looking, they seem utopic, they seem in the distant future. And I think for me, I'm just reminded that every day people are practicing resistance in a profound number of ways, right? While the repression is so immense, in many places, the fact that people are still on the streets is so profound, because literally, depending on where you are in the world and where you live and your positionality, you may know that you may not survive that night, and people are still choosing to do that to some degree. I am so incredibly, I have to say this, I feel so moved today at the fact that the IOF Zionist soldier who killed Hind Rajab has been killed by the Lebanese resistance. That does something for me in my psyche about what it means for people in Palestine and Lebanon to perhaps feel some level of justice. I don't know what they feel. I can't presume to know, but it is not insignificant that happened today. And so I think these kinds of ways in which people are resisting, whatever that looks like, from armed resistance to mutual aid to showing up on the street, to igniting these new hopes, as Andrea and Stephanie, you pointed out, I think they're profound. And so I think just a reminder that the future lives in the present, and that we are building this terrain every single day. And so that's something that I want to remind myself. I'm not trying to preach at anyone, but just that, it's not just about a future, it's being built in the everyday. And every day I am so humbled at the fact that people are, as Beverly, you were pointing out, are still resisting while surviving apocalypse after apocalypse and showing up, and to me, that is, as an organizer, the most important thing to remind each other of, is that we make those choices every day by being in struggle together, right? Like, courage is not something that's inherent. Like, you're not just born courageous. It's a condition that we create by the possibilities that we create with each other. And so how to create courage so that we can continue to resist, I think, is perhaps one thing.
Oh, I like that. How to create courage. That's great. Thanks. Thank you so much, Tasha. Stephanie?
I feel like I maybe jumped the gun a little bit because I was talking about hope, the future before. But maybe I'll take this time instead to really challenge us, and by us, I mean members of the queer community, to be more visible in the struggle. When I have been to the Kaya Sealy protests over the past couple of weeks, I look around in the crowd and I'm seeing maybe one, two, three of us. But we're hidden. And I know that there is fear around visibility. But I think it's so important, to demonstrate our visibility, to demonstrate our solidarity in visibility, because in Trinidad, or in any region generally, where we need the support of the wider public, because we are a minority, because there's still so much stigma and discrimination, we also have to show up for others in a visible way. And there needs to be more of us. And, now, this month, all of this month, we're celebrating Pride. And I hope that we can, as a queer community, reflect on what our responsibility is to the broader movement, what our responsibility is to others, for justice, and just for our humanity, because there's no such thing as a single struggle. And I really hope that we can rise to the occasion and be present for the various communities to which we belong, because we're not just queer people, we're also Black people, brown people, poor people, and we shouldn't throw any part of ourselves away. I know I'm totally ripping off Audre Lorde and all her quotes, but embracing all of our parts, not throwing any parts of ourselves away, and showing up for each other in a way that is meaningful and demonstrates our solidarity.
Listen, I am so moved. I couldn't imagine having this conversation with anybody else other than the three of you. Like, I mean, I'm so grateful that the three of you agreed to do this. This has been just amazing and phenomenal. I just got a little note here. I think it's meant to make a correction. In clarity, it's someone in his unit. I think that is regarding the IOF individual that was killed. It wasn't him. It wasn't the IOF person who pulled the trigger, actually, is what I think the person is saying. But it's someone in his unit. But nevertheless, it still resonates well with us. It still leaves some relief that even though it wasn't directly him, it leaves some relief for people who know this has happened, right? And know the impact this has had on the Palestinian community and, in Palestine and, so, yeah. Anyway, I want to thank everyone who has been following this conversation. To thank you all for following us. I want to thank our speakers, or panelists. I mean, this has just been amazing and generative and wonderful. Thank you to Alessandra Jordan, our technician, who has been streaming live for us. Ward Judah, our social media coordinator on publicity, and Hadley Howe, art designer and coordinator for the creation of all the flyers and posters. We know that the work is a collaborative effort, a collective effort by many of us in doing this together. Most of all, again, I want to thank the panelists for their generosity in what was very generative and amazing. To our followers, thank you for being with us this evening. I want to remind you that the rally and the Pride March takes place on June the 28th. We start in the park, Grange Park, at around 12:30. We meet and we go on the march from there, and then we return to the park around 2, and we meet with we gather together to listen to speeches and songs and celebrate pride and celebrate queer and trans lives. Again, truly appreciate this evening and thank everyone who has been part of it in solidarity, love, and struggle. Thank you. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you, Bev. Good night.
Thank you all.
Night, everyone.
Did you take us off, Alessandra?
Yes, it just ended.
No longer running.
No, it's